This is the Solid Signal Podcast for the week of October 31st, 2022. And it happens to be podcast number 500. Now, I'm going to give myself a little opportunity to take a celebratory lap. And we're also going to take a look back at the very first Solid Signal podcast, as embarrassing as it once was. That was back in 2012, of course. I've been recording this podcast almost every single week for 10 years. 10 years, that's pretty amazing. And just looking back at everything that has changed in the world. And you know, I'm not going to get, interest into the politics and the things and the whatever. But I do want to talk about how solidsignal.com has changed. Back then we were just celebrating our 10th anniversary, and last month we celebrated our 20th. I guess that kind of tracks. But as a company, we're about triple the size that we were. We're not the same organization that we were back then. We were younger and more nimble and more willing to try a lot of different things. And now we are strong and successful and we know what we're doing. And it's a whole different vibe. A lot of the folks that I work with were pretty young 20 years ago when Solid Signal started. And when we did a sort of a 20th anniversary look back, there were a few who gave us elementary school photos in our Throwback Thursday event. And man, did that make me feel old. But even 10 years ago, looking back 10 years, some of the folks who are with us now were still in school, and they hadn't really thought about what they were going to do with their lives. And it's been my genuine pleasure to understand and explore the new generation that has come up since I started doing the Solid Signal podcast. It gives me a lot of pride to think about the folks that I've mentored along the way, about all the advice that I've given, good, bad, and indifferent, in tiny little chunks. When I started the Solid Signal podcast, I got to tell you, it lasted about 5 minutes, and I was struggling to get 5 minutes of content out of it. You can kind of tell. Here's what I mean. Listen to this excerpt from the very first Solid Signal podcast.
The big problem with 4K in 2013 is that there's no content. Nobody's broadcasting. You can't get a 4K movie because there's no way to even get it to you. It would take hours and hours to download, or they'd more or less have to send you a hard drive. It's a little ridiculous. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is not the year of 4K. 2014 maybe, but not this year.
I don't think my voice has changed that much, and yet listen to that recording and it sure has. I know that my presentation has changed a lot. I guess I've gotten a lot more comfortable with the microphone. Back then I kind of wrote down everything that I was going to say because I had no idea what I was going to say. By the way, listening to 2013 me, no, 2014 was not the year of 4K. But eventually we did figure out how to get 4K to people's homes. Internet speeds got faster, and they got Ultra HD Blu-rays now, which is the only time anybody uses the words Ultra HD anymore. And so I guess I was right there. It's just kind of funny listening to myself and how uncomfortable I felt doing that podcast. In the long distance past, I actually had a recording background, a broadcast background. I used to do voiceovers all the time for a radio service. And I guess I'd gotten out of the habit because it seemed like, I just didn't know what I was doing. 10 years later, I'm feeling a lot better about it. I go through and I outline what I'm going to say in a week's podcast, and then I just kind of wing it. And I know some of the podcasts sound like that. They tend to ramble a little bit. But that's how we go. That's how it happens now. I have avoided the opportunity to change the way that I talk deliberately. I've upgraded my equipment a lot. I've got real studio quality microphones and production equipment now, or back then, believe it or not, I was doing all of my production on an iPad, and not just that. And modern iPads are probably fast enough to do it. The iPad 2 was really not. That's the kind of the kindest way I can put it. But I've resisted the urge, as I said, to put on the podcast voice. That's right. I know a lot of people kind of whisper into the microphone. Well, I don't do that. I don't do it because I don't like listening to podcasts like that. I like listening to podcasts where people actually talk. And I make sure that my face is further away from the microphone. If you watch any of these podcasts that they do on video while they're recording the audio, everybody's kind of eating the microphone. And I was never taught to do that. I never did that when I was working in broadcast, and I don't do it now. But looking back, I've had some ups, I've had some downs. The thing that I can say has changed the most, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with speaking my mind on these podcasts. I'm always aware that I'm representing the Signal Group when I'm recording, and I try not to go too far out with my own personal beliefs. As a matter of fact, I try to keep them out of the podcast altogether. And for the most part, we don't talk politics unless there's a really legitimate reason to do it. But I'm a lot more comfortable putting my opinions out there. A couple of weeks ago, I complained pretty loudly about how dark the House of Dragons was. And, you know, I still, that podcast kind of doesn't sit right with me because I got so passionate about it. And I just wonder if that was the right way to go for a corporate podcast. Still, none of you have sent angry letters, and believe it or not, listenership on this podcast has gone up. That's the other funny thing. When I first recorded this podcast, I put it out there on YouTube. That was the only place I could put it. And I syndicated it on, kind of loaded it onto my server so that you could get it yourself if you had a podcast aggregator. Well, that first week, I'm pretty sure I had about 11 listens, maybe not even. Some of those might have been me listening to it over and over again. Well, flash forward about 10 years, and the truth is it's hard to tell exactly how many listens I get because I'm syndicated now on so many different platforms, and some of them give you good answers and some of them don't. Best I can tell, there's about 750 folks who listen to the Solid Signal podcast every week. And the thing is, that really blows me away. It really does. It makes me so grateful to all of you who give me just a little chunk of your week to talk about whatever it is that I find interesting in the world of home entertainment or technology, whatever it is. And when I think about it, it's just amazing. I feel like I have reached out and I have touched a lot of folks in a very appropriate way. I have been a part of your lives. And I'm not going to be so egotistical as to say that I've changed anything. I doubt that I have. I doubt that it's made any difference to anybody's lives. But still, it gives me a source of pride to just know that I've been there. And you have been there too. You've been there with me. More and more of you every week. And that is just incredible. When I take the numbers from this podcast and then add them to the Solid Signal blog, which gets about 200,000 unique people reading it every month. I mean, wow, it's humbling. It's humbling to think that so many people out there have at one time or another been interested in what I have to say. The numbers speak for themselves. We're looking at something on the order of, as far as anyone can tell, about 5 million individuals have at one time or another crossed my path in some way. And wow, just wow. It makes me very grateful for the opportunity. I'm grateful to Signal Group for giving me the chance to express myself in writing, in video, And on podcasts, I'm grateful to all of you who have listened throughout the years, and it makes me just so optimistic for the next 10 years, for the next 500 podcasts. It could very well get to the point at some far distant future where I'm actually getting people reading and listening who weren't even alive when I started doing this, which is astounding. You know, one of the things that I take as a personal point of pride is I try to think about the next generation and what I can do to leave things just a little bit better for them than I found them. I don't know if this podcast really does that. I don't know if the Solid Signal blog in general does that. But I have to hope so. I have to hope that given the opportunity that I have helped participate in the happiness of a few people, in their satisfaction, maybe, just maybe, there's a possibility that something I did made it a little bit easier and a little bit more comfortable for somebody. And I hope, if that's true, and that ends up being you, one of my listeners, that you go ahead and pay it forward. Try to make life just a little bit better for somebody else. The world we live in isn't always easy to like. I will say that for sure. And like I said, I stay away from politics. But it's easy to say that things are tough for people right now in a lot of ways. And whether or not you believe they were better in the past or whether or not you believe they can be better in the future, one thing that you can do is, like I said, try to make things a little bit easier for the people ahead of you than they were for you coming up. I can't think of a better way to end the 500th Solid Signal podcast than with that thought. I thank you all for listening, and keep on, because we'll be back with something a little bit more on topic for podcast number 501. And we'll see you here next week.